Good afternoon, everybody. This is Gary from Vigilant Software. I am one of the sales and support executives at the company, and we're going to be taking you through a training webinar for our vsRisk platform. For people that have seen our demonstrations that we hold on a daily basis, it's going to be a slightly more in-depth version of that, and obviously we do encourage any questions you have as we go through, pop them into the chat box, and we have a 15-minute Q&A session towards the end where we can try and go into a bit more in-depth queries whilst we're live on the webinar, as opposed to obviously setting up a number of support tickets outside of this platform. So we're going to go through a couple of slides to begin with, just to introduce some newcomers to vsRisk itself, and then we're going to move on into the use of the software, maybe cover off some more commonly asked questions that we receive into the support lines here, and then obviously, as I mentioned, we'll finish off in the Q&A section towards the end. So to start off with, as I mentioned, this is a training webinar. It's essentially going to be helping you start your ISO 27001 risk assessment. Today's discussion is going to be going through these 6 elements. So we're going to cover off an introduction to the tool, ISMS creation, a risk assessment, control reviews, reports and the dashboard that the tool is able to illustrate for you, and then finally the Q&A section at the end. So, an introduction to vsRisk. vsRisk is essentially an information security assessment tool created by and for ISO 27001 experts. It's a desktop tool that allows you to conduct an information security risk assessment quickly and easily. It's fully aligned with ISO 27001 in regards to the threats and vulnerabilities that are built into the system, and it comes in 2 flavors, one being a standalone version, so you may have just one risk assessor within your entire organization that's going to be the project lead, and also we have a multi-user version which enables larger organizations to manage their risk assessment across a number of bodies. Maybe you're a larger organization, maybe overseas. You can set people up to be individual asset owners, so they can simply log into the tool, make modifications against their own risks, and then that will be available to everybody else, and then ultimately the organization's administrator or the head assessor for the overall risk assessment to then run the subsequent reports off the back of that. So, ISMS creation. The scope of an information security management system, also known as an ISMS, defines the bounds of a risk assessment. You can create multiple ISMSs within vsRisk, and each one can have a different risk assessment, different scorings, different likelihood and impact scales to each other, and ultimately each one of their reports are kept separate to each other as well. vsRisk, as some of you may be aware if you already own the product or if you're looking to purchase it, comes with one ISMS as standard. And this can be built upon over time with a small financial input from yourselves, and that enables larger organizations to start to divide up certain subsidiaries of either a larger organization, or if you're even working as a consultant, you can break them up individually as well to keep track of your individual clients if you so wish to. So the sample company ISMS that we're going to be able to show you this afternoon, it already contains a library of assets that have been assigned to appropriate organization roles. What we find with smaller organizations, they tend to make a direct copy of the sample company and then make their small tweaks and modifications where necessary. And then you'll have some of the larger organizations that may have already been using Excel-based risk assessments, and they're looking to simply use a tool that's going to help manage that a lot more simply over time. So there are ways in which you can import a lot of the data from a pre-existing asset register, for example, into the tool itself. It has logical threat vulnerability combinations that have been associated with each asset, and relevant controls from Annex A of ISO 27001 that have been applied to each threat and vulnerability combination as well. So risk assessment. vsRisk, just to go through some main points here. vsRisk delivers simple, fast, accurate and hassle-free risk assessments. It produces consistent, robust and reliable risk assessments year after year. So that's what I was referring to a second ago. Instead of having to constantly rely on permanently updating Excel spreadsheets, ensuring that the relevant people have access to those sheets at all times, vsRisk can encompass all that within itself, either through the standalone version or through the multi-user platform. Version 3.0, we do still have some customers that are using our older versions, 2.6 and below, just to make you aware that they are no longer receiving updates, so they are in an end-of-life cycle. However, we obviously will be able to assist on a very basic level with regards to technical knowledge on those. So with features of version 3 over the earlier versions, you can now add custom acceptance criteria. So users can create criteria for particular likelihood and impact combinations, and this will be something we'll cover off as we go through the tool itself. And essentially it will give the assessors greater control to build more sophisticated risk assessments. We've introduced a risk assessment wizard, again something we're going to illustrate when we go through the tool itself. And this will just make things a lot simpler with regards to picking your threat, selecting your vulnerability, what controls and responses you're going to put in place to help mitigate those risks across your business. We have control set synchronizations. This allows users to keep their control sets up to date using an API key which links into our Cyber Comply portal, and that is where we will ensure that all of the control set pieces will continuously remain up to date, and then using the API key will then in turn ensure that vsRisk receives that relevant information as well. And then risk assessment at a glance. The dashboard that we've introduced into this tool, it allows people to, or organizations to, just export a very top level basic output of what their risk assessment is looking like so far. So in case you need to share this with senior management or somebody that isn't directly involved in the implementation of the ISO standard, isn't part of the actual risk assessment, but is still heavily involved in the overall project at large, you can just simply export a small dashboard for them, so you can just give them an indication as to what the top risks are within the business. It also gives you other areas to show how many of your risks you're choosing to maybe treat or tolerate or transfer, etc. So the control reviews that we're going to also go through, this is an area where you can check and view the controls that have been selected as a result of the risk assessment. Now the sample company that we're going to illustrate will show the entirety of ISO 27001-2013's control annex. They will all be selected, and we'll explain why that is and how you can then choose to exclude them later on. Following on to that point below, you can exclude controls or indicate further controls that have been implemented. So there are areas within vsRisk that you can upload or include some of your own internal control sets that you may have. You can specify whether they have been selected due to a contractual, business, statutory, regulatory and legal requirement from maybe a third party to your business, and then all the data entered in the controls viewer is incorporated into the state of applicability. So the reports and dashboard. The reports that this tool is able to produce will be a comprehensive overview of the current state of your risk assessment and treatment process. We will go through the statement of applicability in the way of just simply illustrating to you what information it's going to be able to provide for you. For users that are already obviously currently using the tool, you would have made better use of some of the other 5 that we'll obviously show you as we go through the product itself. And for anybody else that is new to the platform, we do have copies of all of these sample reports that we can obviously share with you after this presentation today, if you so desire. And then obviously at the bottom here, each one of the reports can be printed directly from the tool. They've also got options for them to be exported into Excel documents and also export this, the raw data from them as well. So we are now going to switch screen and go on to our install of vsRisk. Now the install that we're running today is the standalone version, so people that are using this platform, this will look very familiar to you. This install that we're going to be using is an out of the box scenario, so we've run a fresh install, so everything is as you will see when you first come to use the platform. Now with this being a virtual machine that we're using to run the platform on, unfortunately we can't demonstrate how you'll link in maybe things like your Active Directory, but I can point you towards those areas to make that easier if you're going to be using the multi-user platform in the future. So just to give you an introduction to the screen that you will hopefully be able to see your side, we've got the area where you're going to be able to go through your risk assessment. So this is where you're going to be assigning scores to certain risks. You can modify threats, vulnerabilities, etc. We then have that review control selection that we were talking about a moment ago, and this is where you can make those changes as to why you're using controls. You can choose to include controls from other sets if you choose to. We have our dashboard, which is the PDF report that you can pull out of the tool. We've got the reports themselves, so the statement of applicability, your risk treatment plan, etc. And then we have our settings menu, which will go into a bit more detail, as this is where you're going to be able to really build on and customize what the ISMS is going to be doing for you, such as the ability to import assets. You can export a pre-existing asset registry if you want to, if you've built it up inside the tool and you want to keep it back up outside. We're also going to show you how you'd go through user management and change all of your requirements, types, classifications, etc. So as the presentation stated at the very beginning, we're going to walk you through how you would create a new ISMS. Now, I did mention you can copy the sample company. It's a relatively easy process to go through, but because the install we have here only allows one ISMS, we're actually going to show you how to create a new ISMS, but instructions on how to copy the sample are available on our FAQ pages, available from vigilantsoftware.co.uk. So the first stage we're going to go through is setting up our ISMS from scratch. So at the top here, you'll be asked to give the organization's name. Now, if you are using this on a networked machine, so it sits on your domain as an organization, a lot of this information will fill itself in automatically. Alternatively, if you're using it as a very standalone system, like we are on a virtual machine, you are going to have to type all of this information in separately. We then need to give it the lead assessor's name or the display name that you want to be displayed when you first log in. So we're just going to call it me, and then we're just going to give us a quick email address at the top here. If you do have integrated security, this can be toggled on at this stage or toggled off, as it is on by default when you first set this area up. You'll then need to give yourself a username and then your password, like so. And once this has all been completed, we then simply hit next, and it will move us on to which controls we want to make available to us. Now, depending on which control sets you do want, you can simply toggle them on and off. The one that we would only be using is going to be simply ISO 27001, but this can be modified later on in the settings menu. So if you've completed ISO 27001 and you want to move into another area for controls, you can then turn this back on. It's available to you again when you go through your risk assessment. So we'll select next on here, and this will take us into our management and into our management scales to cover both likelihood and impact. As standard, it will put you on a 7x7 grid. These can be modified, and these will be purely down to your own business requirements. It's not something we can tell you what to do or what your scoring system should be. So this is down to yourself to decide what your management scales are going to be based on. So if we leave these both at 7x7, underneath each one of these, you can add additional context. So for example, under impact, our impact is simply going to be on operational days. So obviously depending on how long, how much of an impact on days within the business it's going to have, we can add additional ones on using add context. And we could have something like financial if we wanted to, and going up 1,000, 1 to 3,000, 4 to 7,000, if that is going to be an impact against your business. You could also add in something like that, like reputation, anything like that. There's no limit to the number of context you can add down here. So we'll choose to remove that for now, and we'll select next. This will then take us on to our acceptance criteria in just a second. And as we can see here, we've got that 7x7 grid that we've just set up. Now, as standard, you will only receive acceptable and unacceptable, and part of version 3 is it's now allowing you to add on additional criteria if you so wish. So if we toggle this switch, we've now got an option to add that new criteria. That'll then create this down here, so 13x13. Choose this. We can then rename this to be whatever we see fit or what we want it to be displayed as. We can then choose the coloring just so it's a little bit clearer, and then we can also modify the range over time. And again, all these options are available within the settings menu, so it is something you can modify after the fact of starting your risk assessment. You'll then have the description as to what actually classifies something as a disaster within your criteria range. So we will select finish, and it will return us back to our our welcome page. So now that we've created our ISMS, if we were to go in here, it is going to ask me to log in because we did give it a username and password. So we could just enter this information now, And by selecting login, we can now see that it's welcoming me as the user, and we can then continue on and go through our risk assessment. The one we are going to be working on is the sample company today, as essentially that is the one that has the most content already built into it with regards to the assets, the threats and vulnerabilities, but we will of course cover off the separate areas where you can go through and add on your own custom areas if you wanted to. Another thing to note before we move into the risk assessment is you do have the ability to import an existing ISMS. This is quite handy if you're acting as maybe a consultant. So you will have vsRisk yourself as a consultancy. You might be working with a client, for example, that will also have vsRisk. You can then move the ISMS from one install to the other to obviously have your input on what they need to be doing, what they might need to change, run relevant reports, etc. It's also quite handy if you're moving from one machine to another. You may have created a backup of your ISMS, which you can do down the bottom here using one of these three options. So the export button, you could then use it as a backup, move it across to your new machine, reinstall it, and then re-import the existing ISMS that way around. So we will move on into the risk assessment page now. Now, before I do go any further, I'm not going to answer any questions, but if you do have any, again, I do remind you just to pop them into that chat box, and we can come back to them either straight away if it's something quick and simple, or again, something we'll cover off towards the end of the presentation this afternoon. So we've now gone into our risk assessment area, and this is where you're going to be choosing the asset you want to run the risk against, the threat and vulnerabilities, and so on and so forth. So on the left-hand side, as I mentioned, the sample company has been built to a certain degree. So we've got people like our CIO, our facilities manager, sample users, CFO, etc. Underneath each one of these, you'll then have all of their assigned assets. And this is something you can do when you create your own ISMS, and we'll cover that off a little bit later on as well. At the top here, we have user management. We'll go through that when we come into the settings menu, but it is available to you under this section. We have another option here. By selecting an asset owner, such as the CIO, we can add a new asset at this level. If we select an asset itself, we can choose to remove it, but removing the asset will obviously remove any of its attached risks, as we can see over here. We have our risk wizard, which is what we're going to be using today to show you how to set up a risk to begin with. And then we finally have our help options dotted around the rest of the tool. Now, please note these are not to be confused with a unscored impact, such as the one that we can see at the top right here, where underneath the confidentiality, integrity, and availability, there are question marks, and that's purely because we haven't put the scoring against those just now. Another thing that we can do at this stage is if we chose server room as an example, that could be your overall group. So you could just put server rooms as your group asset, and then underneath each one, you can then specify specific server rooms individuals. So you could have server room A, server room B, for example. To do that, you simply select the asset itself, click the plus button. It will give you an additional drop down underneath. So it will just call it new asset to begin with. You can give it its name. So we could just say server room 1, for example. We can then modify its owner if we wanted to. We can change its type, so whether it's service, people, intangible, etc. We'll leave it as service. We can change its classification within the business, so be that confidential, private, public, internal, and restricted. And there are areas where you can change your types and classifications as well. We can modify the group if we wanted to, so not just by its type. We can change its identification. So if you use identification numbers within the business, that can be entered. You can enter in location details. So if you've got a server based somewhere else in the country or somewhere else in the world, that can be specified here. You can leave comments or notes to mark whether it is a legal requirement or regulatory obligations as to why this asset is kept separate. And then finally, you've got your scores against it. So your score against confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So we will just close off this section, and it will just keep that renamed for us for right now. So if we now go back up to our CIO, what we're going to do is we're going to move on into our risk wizard, and we're going to create a new risk from scratch. So we're going to select on our run risk wizard. 2 seconds. Okay, so we'll jump back into that risk wizard now. Sorry about that. Okay. Just make this full screen. Okay, so as we mentioned earlier in the presentation slides that we were going through, these are the 8 steps you're going to need to cover off in order to create your risks based on an asset, threat, vulnerability, etc. So the sample company does already have pre-existing assets built inside it. These can be exported and modified if you wanted to. We can see all of the ones that are already built in. We can see the new one that we've created down the bottom here, so server room. And then we can see all of the associated information, such as its type, owner, and classification. We've got another field over here, so again, it is another point that you can add on a new asset at this point if you choose to. Once we've made our selection, so we're going to stick with server room 1, we then select next, and then we'll need to assign a threat to this. So our threat could be something like, if we just search, we could put in air conditioning failure. We'll then select next. And the vulnerability for this could be something to do with maintenance. So inadequate equipment maintenance could be our vulnerability. And then we'll select next and we'll move on to what our initial risk score is going to be. So the initial risk score is what the ultimate effect it's going to have on your business if you don't have any response or controls in place. Each one of these has a toggle switch next to them, and the reason for that is the sample company has a requirement set up that you do have to score each one of these individually. On your own ISMS, you can toggle that switch off, so you just give it an overall score against each one of the CAI over here on the left-hand side. In our case, we have got them all toggled on. We use the pencil icon to give it its initial score, like so. And we can do, if we want, just toggle each one off if we choose to, and then that'll have a direct impact when it looks at the residual risk as well. So we'll turn this back on, we'll just rescore this again. We then select next, we then move on into what our response to this risk is going to be. So in this case, we've got modify, share, retain, and avoid. These will have typically been known as the 4 T's, so the treat, terminate, tolerate, and transfer. We're going to choose, in our case, modify. Or in fact, we could choose to share the risk, and then we could just say external electrical company, say company A, we'll just say what they are, and that's just going to be the response. So you can go into as much detail as if you want to, or you can just leave it as brief as you need to for now, and this can be modified later on if you choose to. So once we're happy with that, we can then move on into who the risk owner is going to be. So whilst we have the asset owner as being the CIO, we could set this to actually be a facilities manager when it comes down more to air conditioning failures and so on and so forth. So if we set that now as the facilities manager, excuse me, and then below there we've got an area where we can enter in additional comments if we want to, and we can mark whether they've been actioned, yes or no, below there. Once we're happy with all of this information, we can then just go through, select finish, and it will return us back to our risk assessment page. We now expand on our CIO and expand on the server room and navigate down to server room 1. We can now see that we've got this score in here. We can select on it. We can use the drop down, and we can see that we're actually choosing to share this particular risk, share this with an external body. So this would just simply be a transfer depending on whatever the initial risk score is going to be. Now, if we move on into one that we typically illustrate when we go through our demonstrations, for example, as laptops, we could say there could be a data breach due to an inadequate information security policy. This one's going to be slightly different because it is actually going to cover off some internal control sets, and that's purely because we're choosing to treat this internally ourselves. So by coming onto here, we could then go back into our risk wizard, and this will be based purely on the data breach due to inadequate information security policies. So we'll just give this a second to open itself, like so. So we can see the laptops as the asset, we can see the threat is a data breach, and we can see the vulnerability as being the inadequate information security policy. If we select the pencil icon next to here, this is where we can then go through and make modifications to the initial risk and the residual risk. So for companies that are looking to make a direct copy of the sample company, this is essentially how you'll modify or add in those risk scores over time. So again, we use the same pencil icon, so we're just going to say yes again, it's going to fall into this area. Select next. We've got modify here, so we can just say improvement on UAC. We'll select next because we're choosing to treat this internally, or modify it in this case, and it will take us into our control sets. Now the sample company, unlike the Vigilant Software ISMS that I have just created, I believe will have access to only ISO 27001, so you'll have the entire control set here. We can use drop downs on each one of these to view a description of what the control actually is, and once you've made your selection you just simply click add and it will pop it down here and also populate it over here on the left hand side as well. So if we select next on there, you'll then be asked to give it its residual risk score now. So we're going to go through and say this is now going to fall into a more happy area for acceptable, and just say it's going to be 1. And then we're going to select finish. We can change the owner of this to now be the CIO, as they are essentially who are going to be the risk owner and the asset owner in this case. We select finish. It will return us back to this screen. We now expand, go down to laptops. We can see that this has now been modified. We can see the controls in place. We can see all the scoring that has been input over here on the right hand side. If we select on the controls themselves, if you do have supporting documentation, this will be available to you at this point. We can mark if the control has been implemented, yes or no. If we turn this off, it will ask you to give it a date as to when it's going to be implemented. So we're going to say yes, we'll leave this on. For supporting documents that you wish to have available to you each time you use that control, you use the left-hand column here, and on the right-hand side, if you have supporting documentation for this control, but only in this specific instance, that will then be input on the right-hand side, and therefore it won't conflict each time you use that control across the rest of the risk assessment. If we return back to the risk page, to save you keep going back through the risk wizard each time, if you just need to make small amendments, we can just simply select edit. This is going to be quite reminiscent in the older versions of vsRisk, so it should help you obviously bridge that gap going from old to new within our systems. So at the top here, we can choose to pick our threat and vulnerability separately. So again, as we mentioned in the earlier presentation slides, we've gone through and obviously put together some threat and vulnerability combinations, or you can choose to have them separate like we've got here. So we've had to choose our threat, and then we can choose an independent vulnerability to that as well. You can make modifications to the risk owner. We can change the compromises to toggle them on or off if it doesn't actually have any sort of impact against each one of these. We've got our scoring, we've got our risk response. And then finally, we can also select on our risk response below here. We can choose to change what the response is going to be, and then finally the explanation that ties alongside that as well. So that is the risk assessment area. Again, just to recap, what we've shown you is the risk wizard. We've shown you how to add subsections or subgroups to existing assets. We've shown you where you can add new assets, but we will cover that in more detail in just a moment. We've also shown you how to modify a pre-existing asset, so ones that have been built into the sample company or your own and you need to modify over time, and also the additional areas down the bottom here with with regards to showing your supporting documentation for controls and marking whether that control has been implemented, yes or no. So we're going to close out of here. For new users to the tool, you may notice we don't save very often. That's purely because vsRisk is continuously writing itself to its database. That database is stored in 2 locations. One, if you're on standalone, it'll be in a hidden folder under program data to obviously prevent either unwanted or unauthorized access to it. And if you're using a multi-user platform, that database will be stored on an SQL server as an MDF file, and that allows for multiple users to be continuously updating it at any given point. So that is the creation of an ISMS started. We've gone through and created a new asset, we've created a new risk, and we've also modified an existing risk. We're now going to move on into our review control selection. Now this area is a bit of a whistle-stop tour. It's just to give you an idea as to the areas that you can modify, what changes you can make. You can also outline reasons why you're not including or why you're choosing to include certain controls from other sets if you wanted to. So the first example we're going to use is going to be our A5.1.1 policies for information security. At the top here, we have a drop down. It allows you to navigate to any of the other available control sets within vsRisk. Over here on the right hand side, once you've selected the control you want to work on, you'll have its reference, so its annex reference, you'll have its name, the description of that control, and then you'll have the reason for selection or exclusion from your risk assessment. Now, as standard, because we're looking at the sample company, all of these are going to be automatically ticked as this is the control set we're using, and the fact that it's already been assigned or has a relationship with pre-existing risks. Below there, if you choose to exclude it, you can do so, but you'd need to go back through your risk assessment and remove that control where it is being used currently. And then below there, you'll then have additional areas that you can mark. So say, yes, we're using this control for a business requirement. We could be using it for a contractual requirement, legal, regulatory, etc. And then over here on the right-hand side, you can then put in your more in-depth description as to what the requirement is or why you're having to use it for those particular reasons. Below there, you'll then have an area where you can input your own implementation details, so how you're going to actually implement that control into your business. And then the last section below here, you're then going to have that support and documentation section again. So if you do have the ISO 27001 toolkit, which is available from our partner company, IT Governance Publishing, within that toolkit, there is a zip file which allows you to import directly into vsRisk. And where we've got sample, information security policy, etc., that will then be replaced with the physical Word document, which you can equally go back into and modify at any given point if you needed to. What we're going to have a quick look at now is we're just going to move into a control set that we know we're not using as part of our risk assessment. So we're going to select up here 1.1 from CES, the default administrative password for any firewall or equivalent network device should be changed to an alternative strong password. So we can actually go through these, and this is just to really illustrate what options will be available to you if you do remove it from your risks. You'll have the excluded box here. You can then enter in here why you're choosing to exclude it, save that, or just simply exit out of this screen, and then that will show up on any of your subsequent reports towards the end of the demo. Below there, you'll also have an area where it will start to pull through similar controls across all of the control sets available to you within vsRisk. So we can see here that 1.1 in CES has some form of partial match to ISO 27001 A11.2.4. Equipment shall be correctly maintained to ensure its continued availability and integrity. So that's the review control selection. The next area we're going to have a quick look at now is going to be that dashboard that we've spoken about a couple of times up till this point. So the dashboard itself, it's a phrase we use quite often. It's more form over function. It doesn't necessarily do anything towards the risk assessment. It doesn't help with the risk assessment. It's purely a very nice top-level snapshot of what the risk assessment is looking like, and this is something you can give it in a digestible form to senior management that aren't necessarily directly involved in the project but do need to see how it's coming along over time. So just give this a second to prepare itself. We'll make this full screen so it should be a little bit easier for you to see. So on here, you'll have a breakdown at the top left-hand corner of your risks by rating or by owner. So we can see this very small slither is within the acceptance criteria. And then we have that one that we created for the server room, which is outside the acceptance criteria. We can modify this by owner so we can see how our assets or risks are distributed among the key owners within the business itself. So whether it's the CIO, facilities manager, sample user, etc. We'll then come down here to our control status. So at the moment, we only want to view the controls based on the set we're using. So that's 27001. If you do upload your own internal controls, there will be an additional context down here, which will be named ISM, and that's what it will name your own internal control sets just for your reference. The pie chart itself will illustrate which controls are being planned, which ones are implemented, excluded, etc. This middle pane here will give you a timeline as to which controls, as in your planned risk treatment. So when are you looking to implement those controls? Now the sample company, due to when it was created, they're all going to show as overdue. If you hover over each one, it'll actually give you the exact date when it was meant to be implemented as well. In a more realistic environment, there should only be 2, 3, maybe 4 of these in here, but there is a scroll bar if you are still looking to plan to implement a lot of them in maybe a month or two's time. The next tab on here is simply just a timeline, so it's just going to keep track as to who's modified what, who's last logged in, etc. But when you run the PDF, it will essentially just take a snapshot of what you see on screen. So if you're viewing user activity, that will be available to you on the PDF. If you're viewing the planned risk treatment, that will be what's shown on that PDF export as well. Over here on the right-hand side, we have a pie chart breakdown as to our risk responses. So how many are we looking to treat in-house? How many are we simply going to terminate should that risk occur? How many are we going to tolerate? And how many are we going to transfer maybe to a third party? So the two very small slithers that we have here, most of them are going to fall under the treat, and that's purely because how the sample company is built as standard. And then we've got one tiny slither here, which is that transfer one for the server room. Above there, you'll have a summary of the overall projects. You'll have the number of risks, how many selected controls you're using, how many assets you are running risks against within the business, how many asset owners you have, how many risk owners you have, and then finally how many of your risks have been treated. Lastly, in here, this will be your top risks across your business. It will illustrate or demonstrate up to 8 of them. And again, this is just something you can show off to stakeholders or senior management just to highlight the key areas of the business that are the highest risk, what ones are going to be having the most detriment or most impact against your business, and which ones obviously are going to be needed the eye kept close on the most. At the top right here, we will have the option to export into a PDF document, and then we have a help section to the right of that as well. So we're going to close out of our dashboard now. We're going to move on into the reports. Now, due to the time sometimes these can take to populate themselves, we're just going to go through and show you which reports will be available to you. So you'll have your statement of applicability, you'll have your risk treatment plan, your risk assessment report, risk summary report, comments report, and finally your control usage report. If we open up the statement of applicability now, it will begin to build its report. You'll notice at the top here you'll have filters, so if you are using multiple control sets, you can filter based on which control set you're using. If you go into the risk treatment plan, your risk assessment report, etc., you can then filter them down based on asset owners, maybe whether the controls have been implemented, which ones are overdue, and that's how you can filter the reports to obviously keep for your own records, or maybe share with those stakeholders for those to be aware of which controls they need to be implementing, which dates they are. You could run a report to see if any of them are now overdue, and obviously that will be a key way of keeping track of your risk assessment as well. At the top here, under your statement of applicability, this should look very familiar to people that are already working towards the standard or the accreditation. You'll have the name of the ISMS, you'll have your organization name, you'll have when this report was published, you'll have its version number, so it will always start from 1, 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, etc. And then finally you'll have who published this report as well. Each time you change a filter at the top here, you simply rebuild the report and it will give it a new version number again. Below there, you'll then have the actual control set that you're working with, followed by the controls, the title, descriptions, and whether the control has been implemented or whether it's applied yes or no. Along the bottom here, you can use vsRisk if you choose to as a almost a slideshow if you wanted to, so it does work in the same way as maybe PowerPoint would. You can use some more presentation tools over here as well. We can choose to export this into multiple formats, being PDF, XPS, Excel 2003, 2007, and also the ability to export into raw data as well. So this is the report section. Like I said, we're not going to go through each one because they do take a while to compile themselves the more and more we keep producing. But just to make you aware, also, if you do have multiple ISMSs, this is where it will separate each one from another. So whilst we're in the sample company, we're going to be on 1.0. If we then went into Vigilant Software and ran a report, it's not then going to make that report version 1.1. It will keep itself at 1.0. So they'll continually work independent to each other if that's how you set it up to do that. So we will close off of here now, and we're going to return back to this home page again. And the last section we're going to go through before we come into the Q&A section are going to be the settings. So this is where you can over time customize your ISMS, customize what vsRisk can really do for you. It's an area where you can upload or modify your own assets, threats, vulnerabilities, control sets, etc. So under the System tab, first of all, we're going to go through some areas that you would have most likely covered off towards the beginning of your ISMS creation. So at this point, you've got your configure criteria area. So again, we can allow additional criteria, and this can all be done even though you've already gone through and created your risk assessment, modified your scores, and so on and so forth. The next tab along will be your impact and likelihood scale. So again, you've still got the option to add on additional context even after the fact of starting your risk assessment. You can modify these scales. However, what will happen if you enable the change, you will receive a warning basically making you aware that if you do change this, you're going to have to go back through each and every one of your risks and rescore them based on the new impact and likelihood scales that you've created. So we're just going to select no on here. The next one is that control set selection area. So this is something that we covered off earlier on. So if you're working on ISO 27001, you've completed that risk assessment, you've been audited, absolutely fine. You may then want to branch off into other control sets or other accreditation fields. You can always toggle them on and off under this section if you want to. The next section you'll come to, will be your classification fields. So if you recall, when we set up our initial or server room 1, we could choose from any one of these classification fields. These are all part of the sample company. Yours may be different, they may be the same. You can edit these if you want to by adding in additional classification fields. But please be aware, if you are importing large asset registers, you do need to ensure that your classification fields match what is going to be imported. The tool won't be able to update one without the other. The next tab that you'll come to will be your type, so whether it's a hardware, software, IP, information, database, etc. These again can be edited upon if you want to. These are part of the sample company. So you can add additional criteria, and again, this will also need to match an import of a CSV file containing your a pre-existing asset register. The next tab along is your risk calculation. This is an area that we can't tell you what to do. This is something that you need to decide in-house, maybe with a consultant firm, or just simply your calculation you're going to be basing your risk assessments on. So you'll have things like impact plus likelihood -1, impact times likelihood, or simply impact or likelihood. Below there, we then have an area where you can test out what your calculation is actually going to do, like so, just so you've got a better understanding as to what sort of risk scores you're going to be looking at. The next tab along on here is your requirements. So under the requirements, if you recall earlier where we were going through the compromises, so confidentiality, integrity, and availability, we chose to score each one of them separately, where we could toggle each one on and off. If you don't want that to be the case, simply toggle it off. But please bear in mind again, if you do toggle this off, you'll have to go back through the risk scoring again and give each one its new score based on your own requirements. The additional requirements under here will be assess your likelihood to affect confidentiality, integrity, and availability separately, assess legal, contractual, and regulatory requirements separately, yes or no, and also assess residual risk on a per control basis as opposed to just the overall risk itself. The last tab on here is under toolkit. So if you recall earlier, I did mention that our one of our partner companies, IT Governance Publishing, do sell a toolkit, and that can be imported in bulk here. So with that zip file that's contained within the toolkit, you simply click on here, select on import, find the file location, and all of these will turn from uneditable sample documents to Word or whatever the Office program is you're using, where you can then customize these to your own business needs. The next tab we're going to move on to is the user management area, as well as audit history and your license. So under user management, unfortunately, I can't demonstrate it to its in its best purely because this is a non-domain machine, so I can't show you Active Directory setup. But just to explain how it would work, you'd simply select add a new user. Under here, we could select whether integrated security is toggled on, yes or no. It is toggled on at the moment, but if we select on here to go into our Active Directory, in theory, it should be blank. So yes, Active Directory could not be located. If you are using this on a domain machine that has access into your contact list and so on, you can then access it here. So all you need to do is select on the search icon. It will give you your entire Active Directory list, search for that item or that person. It will then populate all of this information automatically for you, create the user, and then they'll go to the bottom of the list where they can be used either as an asset owner, risk owner, but it also acts as the way of that person actually logging into the tool itself. If we go to a pre-existing one, for example, our CIO, that seems to be the guy that we're picking on the most in today's presentation. This is an area where you can modify their access levels. So if the CIO already exists, we can toggle on or off if they use integrated security or not. If they don't, we can force change the password when they next log on. We can modify their name, their email address, quite handy if you have a change in positions within the business, and then finally their role within the use of vsRisk itself. So an administrator role gives them full access to absolutely everything within vsRisk, all of these menus we're going through, all of the assets, all of the risk owners, etc. Asset owner simply allows them into the assess risk area where they can work on and modify their own risks with their own assets. They can't go into the settings menus and they can't run reports. A consultant has every level of access other than user management and some of the more database critical areas, but they can run reports. And then finally, revoked is if you just want to block that person from logging in, again, using that example of a change of position, you may want to block the original owner of the risks. So you can revoke their access once that position has been refilled, enter in their new information, and then give them back into their original role, whether that was administrator, asset owner, or consultant. By revoking an access, because users are seen as asset owners and risk owners, they will have their associated risks and assets. If you revoke them, it simply blocks access. If you delete a user, however, it will then also remove all of their attached assets and risks as well. So please be sure you're definitely wanting to complete that action before going ahead and doing that. The next tab along on here is albeit a relatively basic audit history, so it won't give you the specifics of what users have done when they've been logged in, but it will give you a basic understanding as to what areas of the tool they have been working on. So we can see here, as of the 25th this afternoon, we had edited assets, we've gone in, we've edited owners, we've logged in, and again, we've edited assets over here as well. If you do want to keep more of a detailed track, you can leave comments over here on the right-hand side as maybe the organization's administrator, just to keep a closer eye on what changes have been made at certain times and dates without running reports. The last section on here is going to be your license. So the license itself is key, and it does link directly to the machine it is logged on to or installed on. So if you are moving from one machine to another, we would always recommend locating the .lic file, copying it, or simply deleting it off of the existing machine, and then when you come to reinstall it, it will then reinstall without giving you an error message of you've now exceeded the number of installs. If you do fall into the rare occasion of maybe a laptop has failed completely, a computer has failed, you can't get onto it to remove that license, contact support and we'd be more than happy to issue you out a new license for your new machine and deactivate the old one. The next tab along we're going to come to is going to be database. So for connection to set up, start off with, if you are a standalone user, this area is not going to be relevant to you at all in the slightest, purely because vsRisk will automatically find its home on your C drive straight away, or whatever your primary drive is. If you do have multi-user or network enabled as it used to be called, this would be where you'll point it towards a server location. You'll then outline whether it's Windows authentication or SQL authentication. Depending on which one you've chosen, you'd then be asked to enter in a username and password, and then finally you'd point it towards the database itself on that SQL location. You'll have a number of key features down the bottom here. So you'll have an area where you can test that connection, where you can just reset all of the information you've done, or go into a more advanced area if you want to. Finally, once everything has been confirmed, the test connections have all worked, it's linked to the SQL, you hit save, and that's it. The string has been created. This client now has access to the MDF file, and all you'd need to simply do is just repeat that action each time you're installing the client onto another machine within the business. The next area we're going to come to is where you can import a pre-existing asset register. So providing your headers are all in this same configuration, it will then import seamlessly into the tool. Alternatively, if you want to start one from scratch or copy and paste it into one sheet to another, we do have the Excel template ready for you to download at the top right hand corner. It will look like this. You just need to then populate the following cells below each one. To go back on what I mentioned earlier regarding the types and classifications, they are areas you do need to ensure will match your asset register, so please do double check that before trying to import them. If you do fall into any errors, contact our support page with the screenshot of what the error message is, and we should be able to pinpoint exactly what's caused the problem to help you then import the asset register in its entirety. We do also allow for you to export a pre-existing asset register. So this is a sample company. The reason for this is so that if you want to use the sample company as your building block, but not necessarily use the sample company ISMS, you can just export these into a CSV file, create your new ISMS, make modifications where you see fit here, and then re-import it back into the tool. Alternatively, it could just be simply so you can keep a backup of the register outside of the tool itself. The next tab along is where you will be able to backup and restore. Now, if you're using an SQL server, you may have your own backup mitigations in place, but if you are a standalone user, this just allows you to simply make a backup of the database itself on a separate location. It can be anywhere you want it to be, USB stick, external hard drive, maybe another drive on the machine, just in case of just to try and mitigate on single point of failure. And it's just a nice way to make sure that the work you are completing isn't going to go to in vain if you do suddenly have a crash of a laptop, etc. The next three here are where you can start to really build on what is already available to you in vsRisk itself. So at the top here where you've got threats, you can then plus at the top. It will then drop down a box here so you can enter in your own threats and vulnerabilities specific to your business. So you'll need to give your threat its title, followed by its description, and then these will then become available to you as you go through either the risk wizard or when you're going through the right-hand side attributes panel when creating the risk. The next tab along is vulnerabilities. This works in exactly the same way, again with its title and its description. And then finally under controls, there are additional areas here. So if we select on the plus button, you will see that your new framework is going to be called ISM. So that's something I touched on earlier when we were going through the dashboard. You can enter in your own referencing numbers. So if you do have your own internal reference, you can pop that onto this section. And then finally followed by its title and description. Now, one thing I did mention earlier was if you created this control here, for example, so the framework is ISM, its reference, we'll leave it as X1.1. And then the title and description. When you go into your review control selection, not only can you see 27001, PCI, CES, etc., you'll then also be able to see your new framework, ISM, and you can upload your own support and documentation. Mark whether this control has actually been put in place for a legal requirement, whether it's a business requirement. So it gives you that same level of access to your own control sets, not just the ones that we provide within the tool itself. So the last two sections we're going to go through, these are relatively quick, and then we'll move on into Q&A. I can see some questions are coming through already, so we'll move on to those in just a second. So the area where we can ensure that the vsRisk control sets are kept up to date is under here. This is a completely free of charge section. We do encourage all of our users to make use of it when you do have access to the software itself. You simply register using your email, first name, last name, and organization. You receive an API key via email, pop it into the API key box, link the account, and that's it. It's a one-time thing. It doesn't need to be worked on or modified over time. And each time you launch vsRisk, it will ping the CyberComply server to see if there are any updates and pull down those relevant updates where they are needed. Last couple of sections, with this being a training webinar, and this will be for existing customers, we're just going to go through a couple of either frequently asked questions, something that either isn't on the FAQ page or something that you might just need to know for use in the future. What we will need from you, if you ever do need to contact us, we will need things like what version you are running. We typically can see that anyway from your license. Another thing we may require from you is going to be the build version that you're currently using. This helps us identify if you need an update to a later version, or if we know that there was a known issue on the version you're currently running and which one to move you on to. But it also helps us for bug tracking. If you found something as an issue with the software on that version, it allows our development team to work on that based on the number that is shown on the screen. The last section on here will then be support. The help and support pages have been recently updated, and they do frequently get updated where needed. There are video tutorials on there to show you how to do certain simple tasks such as moving from one machine to another. The point I mentioned earlier where you can also copy the sample ISMS, that's also on there in a video format, so you can simply watch it as you're going through and doing it yourself as well. The last section on there is our contact information. That will give you our support address. It comes into our ticketing system where you'll receive an autoresponder that will allow you to have an expectation as to when that response is going to come from myself or one of the team here. If we do have to submit this for a development team query, we will make you aware of that. We'll do our best to give you an outline of the timescale it may take to resolve, and obviously we'll keep you updated as that progresses as well. Now, there's a couple of other points we are going to cover off today. Just so that if you do have any queries or you are wanting to move from one machine to another, moving from one laptop to another is one of our more commonly asked questions. What you would need to do is to ensure that the license key and everything comes with you as well as your database. You will have your backup file, which you can find in your settings, and obviously that will be wherever you chose to store it. If we ever ask for a copy of your database, what you'll need to do is navigate to your C drive. Here, by standard, you'd need to go to View, select Hidden Items. So if we hide them at the moment, you won't be able to see program data. So you'd need to go to Hidden Items. You'll then be able to go to Program Data. There'll be one in here known as Vigilant Software, vsRisk, and then finally these are the files we're most likely going to ask from you. Our vsRisk log allows us to determine what may have caused an issue. We have your database all stored in here, so this is where it's going to be continuously updating. We then have the license itself, so if you are moving from one machine to another, you will need to delete this from this machine, uninstall vsRisk, reinstall on the new machine, and then your license will be available to use again on that new machine. Again, like I said, if you do fall into system failure for whatever reason though, contact us and we can give you a new license key. At the top here, you'll then have additional boxes for toolkit files, template files, web root information as well, which is mainly to do with our scripts and the images that are used within the tool itself. So that brings me to the end of today's demonstration on vsRisk. We'll go through some of the questions now. We have got a couple. I'll read them out loud if that's okay, and that way obviously we should be able to keep these on the recording as well. So, can I create my business customized control set, or must I use a combination of available control sets? I think, Rian, we did answer that literally just a second ago under the settings menu. So yes, you can use a combination of your own control sets in conjunction with a pre-existing one within vsRisk. Darren Salmon, support for deployment as a Citrix application allows remote use of the application. I'm not too sure on that, Darren. Either could you just go into a little bit more detail if you want to? Alternatively, I can always come back to you after the meeting today and discuss that in more detail with you. Yes. So with regards to centralized installation, the multi-user version that we distribute or that we sell will allow you to have the database stored on a central SQL server. So you'd need MS SQL, a knowledgeable network administrator. You will need to ensure that the database that is being created has full read and write permissions for the individual users to access that database. With regards to the specifics of Citrix, and this sort of thing I'd need to find out outside of the presentation. I can come back to you at a later point regarding that, if that's okay. Okay, perfect. Okay, Sean, is there a limit to the number of projects you can run on a single user license? No, there isn't. So as you can see on my screen here, I have the standalone version, or I hope that was made clear as we went through some of the settings menus. If you are working as a consultant, we do work with other partners that are consultancy firms, and they use our tool for that exact use. All you'd need to have on here are just a number of ISMSs. So I think my license actually covers me up to about 25. I'm not going to, because I'm doing this on a laptop screen. It won't scale well enough for me. For me to be able to view all of them. But yes, there's no implied limit of the number of projects or ISMSs you can have working on. Typically, most consultants will have about 7 or 8 running at any given point, but that can all be done under the one user license. It's simply the ISMS that it links to, and obviously they are a purchased add-on anyway. Craig, is it possible to redirect the database to a different folder for a standalone install? It's not. vsRisk will automatically find itself on the primary drive. That cannot be modified, I'm afraid. Okay, I think that's all of the questions that have come through. So what we will do is we will finish off now. So we're just going to switch back now to our slideshow. So we've covered Q&A for the time being. These are the additional products that we also have as part of the Vigilant software portfolio. So we have our risk assessment software, we have our online compliance manager, as well as our data flow mapping tool, which will help simplify your GDPR data flow mapping project. We will leave it on this page. Obviously, this is our contact information. So we have our website. On there, you'll have areas for support. You'll have areas to request additional demonstrations if you want to. And then we have our support section. So the support at vigilantsoftware.co.uk. That will come through to myself here and the rest of the team that will be happy to help within a 24-hour period. And then we also have our phone number on there as well as all of the social media links as well. So if there's no further questions coming through, the webinar is due to be open until around 20 past to 3:30. I'm going to pop myself on mute now just so you don't get the background noise from our office when I stop speaking. And any additional questions that come through, I'll either type them in or I'll just unmute myself to quickly answer where I can. But again, thank you very much all for your time this afternoon. I hope you found this informative and something that either helps you with a procurement decision or helps you with regards to some queries you might have had in the use of the software over time. But thank you very much. Have a nice afternoon, and I look forward to speaking to you all shortly. Thank you.